Hello, I'm Dr. Kayleen Asbo, and I want to invite you to episode 6 of The Roots of Wisdom. We're going to explore in this episode the ancient Greek mysteries associated with grief, lamentation, and transformation. The mysteries that are associated with Dionysus and Ariadne. Now, we've been exploring in this series this marriage of these two worlds, the Hebrew masculine world of the patriarchs and the prophets, the Old Testament figures that we have from the Hebrew Bible that become the Old Testament of the Christians on the one hand, and the other world, the world that's associated with the feminine in ancient Greece. Whether that is the philosophers who were the lovers of Sophia, who was seen as the embodiment of wisdom, or the great mystery religions and mystery traditions. These two streams come together in a marriage to create the love child that is Christianity. So for a final episode in this particular series, it's very suitable that we're going to be talking about marriage, about the marriage between the human and the divine, between different worlds, and what that entails as a rite of passage in life. This is also deeply related to the archetypal themes of what we would call the heroine's quest. Many of you are familiar with Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. Much less has been written about the particular qualities of the heroine's quest or the rituals of the feminine. And I'll remind us that when we talked about the feminine, it doesn't just mean women. It actually also relates to the feminine within us, that in Jungian depth psychology, the feminine is the part that is associated with the depths, with emotions, with the intuitive capacities, and with the earth. And so when we talk about themes that are around this initiatory realm into the feminine, whether that's the feminine part of a man or a woman's initiation ritual, there are certain themes that come up again and again and again that are a little bit different than the classic hero's journey blueprint. And one of those is that almost every one of these myths has to do with betrayal or abduction. Rather timely to be thinking about in our current culture. That there is a descent to the underworld. We already saw that when we talked about the myth of Inanna. But that is a very common theme. The theme about dismemberment, of having parts of yourself torn to pieces and having to put them back together again. We saw that with the myth of Isis, and we touched on it last week with Dionysus, who represents the feminine principle in the masculine world of the Greek gods. Then there is also this theme of rebirth, and the rebirth happens through the heart, the importance of the heart for renewal as opposed to the head. And then the last piece of this journey that we find cross-culturally in myths of virtually every culture when it's talking about this initiatory realm of the feminine is that either a return to the depths of the earth itself and or an elevation to the heights of heaven in rituals of ceremony of union with the divine, the bridal chamber. Now, a way that we can see some of these threads coming into Christianity is really quite fascinating. There is a figure, a mystical theologian, upon whom centuries and centuries and centuries of Christian writing was based. And he was known as Dionysius the Areopagite. He happens to be the patron saint of Paris, and you will find him, this image on the far right is the statue that is at Notre Dame Cathedral. And you will find other statues of him as well. And what I invite you to notice is that he has lost his head, and it's at the level of his heart. The mystical theology that is particularly present in the Orthodox Christian tradition is about learning to see with the eyes and ears of your heart. And this becomes the foundation for so much of monastic life. His very name, though, Dionysius, the Areopagite, should make you perk up, because that first name is the name of the Greek god of wine, of ecstasy, of joy and suffering, the god that we began to explore last week. The story of this figure can actually be found in the Acts of the Apostles, where it was believed that he was the priest of Dionysus, presiding over rituals. And St. Paul arrived and said, "You have a statue to an unnamed god. I can tell you his name." And there was this story that the priest of Dionysus recognized in Christianity something that was what we would call an archetypal truth of his own experience, and adopted Christianity then and became a priest of Christianity and came actually eventually to Paris. There's a whole mythology behind this. I just want you to have a sense of the layering here. And that what looks like a rather grisly decapitation, if we take it literally on the left, which is part of the story of Saint Denis. He was in Paris. They said that he was martyred and his head was cut off, but he picked up his head because he didn't like where he was laying for his body. And so he climbed to the top of the mountain and then laid down and put his head there. And that's where we have the Sacré-Cœur on Montmartre, the Mount of the Martyrs, Sacré-Cœur, the Sacred Heart. And it's 2 blocks away from where Eric Satie composed the Noisienne in Paris. So that theme of how can we find our way into our heart? How can we have new eyes and new ears to be able to see and hear with the eyes of our heart is part of this deep tradition that gets passed from the ancient Greek world with the rituals of Dionysus into the mystical Christian world, particularly in the Orthodox tradition with the mystical writings of Dionysus the Areopagite. Fascinating layering. Next time you go to Paris and you're on Montmartre and you're there and you're strolling the cafes and you see Sacré-Cœur, think about this layering, one on top of the other. We already explored how Notre Dame itself was a temple to Isis, Isis, Paris, Isis Mary. And here on the top of Paris, we have the Dionysian tradition and the mystical tradition, one on top of the other. Now, we're sorely lacking in initiatory rituals in our world, and I'm going to go on just a little bit of a rant. Think about most teenagers' coming of age experiences. When they turn old enough in order to drive, they're given the keys of a car and off they go. Far more often when they become adults, when they reach the age of consent, as it's called, what happens? They do a pub crawl, right? That last one is a really sad and sorry echo of what used to be a rich and profound tradition. Many cultures have this idea that when it's needed for you to cross a threshold, how do you know? How do you know you've gone from being a kid to being a grown-up? Is it simply because you can drive a car and drink a beer? That's pretty shallow. That's pretty shallow. So we've lost this sense of ritual in our world, and there are so many rituals that I think we are suffering from because we don't have rituals. What do we do with our grief? What do we do with our sorrow? Is there any place that we can go to share an experience of outrage that doesn't lead to violence? What can we do with the tenderest, most vulnerable parts of ourselves so that they can be held gently by others? What do we do to throw off the shackles and act in ways that are life-giving, that temporarily set aside all of the constraints that we live in our day-to-day life, so that we can experience liberation and freedom, but not live the next day to regret it? How can we do these things? The ancient Greeks knew far better. They had ritual times throughout the year that were dedicated to communal expressions of grief, of mourning, of anger, of frustration. And they really felt that in some ways it was only by going through these together that you could not be stuck inside of them. And modern psychologists have talked that one of the things that we really suffer from in our world is an inability to process the dark emotions. And we see evidence of this all around, where things get bottled up so much that they either eat us alive and we fall into deep despair and depression, or, as so tragically is often the case, there's an eruption with great violence in the world. So how do we do this? Well, we're going to talk today about some of the rituals that could hold the dark experiences of what it is to be human, and how they combined and put together a story with certain rituals that helped people not stay stuck in the darkness, but move through it into transformation. There's a lot of interesting work that's been done on ritual process, and the work of Arnold van Gennep and Victor Turner is very helpful for looking at this. They talk about the necessity of separating away from your normal world, going to a special place that's far off. We might even call it going on pilgrimage, if you will. Going to a special place that was a liminal place of transformation. And in this special place that was set aside, very often what could lead to change and transformation is that the normal way of doing things was completely suspended. And sometimes strict societal taboos would be completely violated in order to throw off the shackles, have an expansion of the heart, and then you would adopt, like a cloak, the rules of society as you went back into the world. But that when you returned into the world, you were not the same person that left. That unlike the pub crawl for the 18-year-old or the 21-year-old, you actually come back from this initiation experience with some wisdom, with some very deep change, as a mature being who has more to offer the community. And that was actually seen as being a necessary part of this initiation process. It wasn't for you only, although it was for you as well. It was so that you could step into the world and offer your gifts of wisdom. And how could you do that unless you had been initiated? It couldn't happen. So very important to look at these roles, these rituals of initiation. Many of them associated with the figure we talked about last week, about Orpheus and the Orphic mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries. So important that the world would have a ceasefire during times of war, during the month where this happened. And those initiatory rituals have in common this theme of descent. The descent of Orpheus to find his beloved Eurydice, the descent into the world to see the dark goddess of Persephone and the dark lord Hades, to confront one's mortality, to confront one's fears. And until we had done that, we weren't really fully mature in this life. We weren't prepared to take on the mantle of responsibility. So many of these initiation rituals then can be traced to the Greek god Dionysus, who the Romans appropriated later as Bacchus. Same god, two different names, Dionysus and Bacchus, who is the god of wine and the god of ecstasy and so much more. And that idea of finding one's heart, losing one's head to find one's heart, is such a deep part of the Dionysian rituals and the Orphic rituals, this theme of keep singing no matter what. Even when your head is dismembered, how do you find your heart to keep singing? Some of his early titles were the Liberator, the god of ecstasy, the tragic god. He was the god of paradox, of both stillness and mania, and also the god of surprise. One of the titles associated with Dionysus was Epiphanos, the Epiphanos of the sudden realization that we get the word epiphany. When you have an epiphany, you have the aha moment where everything suddenly transforms. It transfigures around you. What you once did not have eyes to see is the eureka moment, and now you do. He was Epiphanos, the god of sudden wisdom that came unexpectedly. All of this was part of his mythos that is associated. You could never predict when he might show up. And when he did, he would cause the world to turn a little bit upside down, to throw off the shackles. You cannot bind him. There's a story about him being chained and imprisoned into one of the towns that he comes to. And those chains turn into vines and slither off. That he cannot be held. He cannot be confined. He is here to liberate, and especially to liberate the heart. And I'll remind us that then that in the Orphic religion, he was known as the thrice born. Born first in a cave amidst animals from Zeus in the form of a snake. After his dismemberment as a young child, his heart becomes the vehicle of his rebirth, as the heart is given to a mortal woman who becomes pregnant. She is destroyed in the ashes of the revelation of Zeus, and once more the baby Dionysus then gets born again, this time from the thigh of the masculine. And this idea, if we look at it, is so interesting, that we have birth from the animal realm, birth from the feminine, the mother, birth of the masculine. So it's all of these different parts coming into a wholeness from a psychological perspective that comes and is delivered with this message of the heart. Now, Dionysus was often known as the feminine god because he was hidden and dressed as a little girl so that Hera wouldn't find him. So you'll see images like this one by Bouguereau. If I hadn't told you who that was, would you have thought it was a young maiden? Very, very feminine and very androgynous in many of his depictions. But being the god of paradox, he will also show up as the wild sort of green giant with a hairy beard. So you see him in all these different transforming guises. But so often he was called the women's god because he was surrounded by women. Here he is as a youth, and then all of the maenads, the bacchantes, are dancing around him in nature, in the wildness. We find image upon image of Dionysus surrounded by women, and also related then to our animal nature. Here he is riding on a leopard. So to be in contact with the feminine with oneself and the instinctual self are really part of his deep symbolism. Now, if I told you then that he was the god of wine, of ecstasy, of losing your head, of wild parties in the forest, who was always surrounded by voluptuous women dancing naked and playing drums, what would you suggest the chance for him being a happily married man would be? Probably not great. So it's actually one of the greatest ironies of Greek mythology that Dionysus, what we think of as the wild party boy, actually becomes the most happily married man in the entire Greek pantheon. That's just yet another way that we have his mythos of paradox. So here is an image from the 5th century BC of Dionysus with his bride Ariadne. And unlike Zeus and Hera, who are always fighting to pieces, their whole life was War of the Roses, Dionysus and Ariadne are actually this very happy, beautiful, contented couple. And it's their story that we're going to focus on today. One of my great mentors, Christine Downing, says, the problem with Greek mythology is where do you begin? Because you're always starting in the middle of a story. And before you can actually get to the part that you're going to talk about, you have to tell about the parents and the grandparents, because otherwise it's really not going to make sense. So we actually have to go back and talk then about this myth of the Minotaur, a Minotaur who is half bull and half human. And the way this story goes is that during some political battles, King Minos of Crete wanted proof that he was to be the rightful ruler. And he prayed to the god Poseidon to send a sign from the sea that he was the one to win the election. And the bull emerges from the sea. This white bull comes from the ocean. And everybody recognizes immediately, this is a sacred sign. This is no ordinary bull. Now, Minos was supposed to sacrifice it back to the god from which it came. He was supposed to offer it up to Poseidon. But he said, oh, it's such a beautiful bull. It's really something. How about I substitute and give my second best bull instead. So he was no longer willing to offer up what should have been the very best to the gods. Instead, he kept for himself that which should have been given away. Bad idea. Really bad idea. You don't do this and get away with this in Greek mythology. And the way that Poseidon got his revenge from not getting his due was that he made King Minos' wife fall in love with the bull and have this crazy desire to actually unite with the bull. And so according to this, the great architect Daedalus built this contraption, and indeed they made it, and from that union was born the Minotaur. And this is an image from 4th century BC, and this one, the Minotaur is awfully cute. It's like, oh, little baby Minotaur. But as it grew up, this Minotaur was rapacious, and it had this hunger in it, this hunger to eat innocence. And Crete actually created this tribute that had to happen with 7 youths every year from the different places from Athens to come and to be fed to the Minotaur. They became the Minotaur's food. If this sounds vaguely like the Hunger Games, you're right. This is the myth that inspired that author. And so a labyrinth was built. It was actually a maze to house this hungry beast who would eat innocence. And in this story then, the Minotaur had a half-sister named Ariadne, and she alone was really immune from the rage of the Minotaur. There's a story that Homer gives us that she could dance on the labyrinth. She was the mistress of the labyrinth, and her symbol was milk and honey. Milk and honey and dancing. She could dance in the shadows of the labyrinth. Well, one year, the Prince of Athens wanted to put a stop to all of this. He didn't want there anymore to be this horrible human sacrifice that was happening. So he offered himself. He volunteered as tribute, much like the way those of you who've seen the Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen does the same thing. He volunteered to go instead. And when he arrived, he and Ariadne, it was love at first sight. And the princess of the labyrinth then did not want him to die. And she had something that she gave him. It was a big ball of thread that would help him find his way through this maze so that when he killed the Minotaur, he would be able to find his way back out again. This ball of thread, by the way, was called a clue. And so we actually have the phrase to get a clue, and it comes in its roots from this myth. So she gave him this ball of thread, this clue to find his way through the maze. And here we see another image of the ball of thread again. In many versions, it's actually red thread to help him remember and find his way through. And here you have Dante Gabriel Rossetti's spindle as he goes to confront the Minotaur in this cartoon-like image. And there he does battle with this Minotaur. And he defeats it. And when he's done, then he goes to take Ariadne, his beloved, and he's promised her that he'll get her away. I mean, this is a really dysfunctional family, right? Your father is upsetting Poseidon. Your mother is sleeping with animals. Your half-brother is a Minotaur. And you thought you had it bad, right? So in this story, Theseus, the prince, is going to rescue her and take her back with him to be his princess. And off they go, betrothed, happily ever after, all is well. Or is it? Because according to all of the myths, then somewhere along the journey back home, Theseus forgets. He has a colossal case of amnesia. And he actually ends up sailing away and leaving her on the shore. There's a whole opera by Richard Strauss called Ariadne auf Naxos that is about this very story, about Ariadne being abandoned, having been utterly betrayed and being left forsaken on the shore. But in some of the versions of the myths, the reason why Theseus falls into this sleep of forgetfulness is that he's not supposed to be the one that she marries at all. He's too small. Even though he's a prince, he's actually human. And according to this myth, Ariadne has been destined to be the bride of Dionysus, and he has a sole claim to her. So in some of the versions of the stories then, Theseus is put under the spell of forgetfulness. There's the boat sailing away in the harbor. This is also to miss the boat. Think of that phrase. All right, so she's missing the boat. And here she's asleep. She can't be woken up. She's sort of the original Sleeping Beauty who can't be roused as well until Dionysus arrives. And you see his animal companions here, the leopards, coming up, swirling around Ariadne as she is roused gently from sleep. This is the statue at Versailles. There she is again, asleep with her great big ball of thread, her clue. And when Dionysus arrives, he's got the whole company. Everybody is here with him to claim her as his bride. So in this painting by Titian, you have the Bacchantes with their drums. You have Silenus, who was the patron saint of the viticulture of the vines, arriving. You have the leopards and the wild animals. And then you see over on the far right, you see the little satyrs with their goat hooves and their animalistic ways. And there she is looking for the boat that's sailing off in the distance. And here, most unexpectedly, comes Dionysus to say, oh, honey, forget about that. I'm your true husband. I'm your true husband. And so he arrives. In some of the versions, Venus herself provides the wedding ring. So here we have Venus and then Cupid, or Eros, if you will. And notice that Dionysus is stepping up with his leopard skin loincloth. How's that for a groom's attire? And putting the ring on her finger, while above her there is a crown that Venus was said to have given her. Here it's a literal gold crown. And this crown was actually a crown of stars. This one cracks me up because isn't there always one wedding guest at the party that is tempting to look like this? There's the stepfather, the foster father, Silenus, drunk as a skunk in the left side, and Dionysus here offering his hand in marriage to the weeping Ariadne. So we find these images again over and over, and I'll call your attention to the fact that in so many of them, she's bare-breasted. Now, this wasn't just because artists like to indulge in the female beauty. It's also another symbol to be bare-hearted, to be vulnerable. That if you think of the bare-breastedness as a symbol of, I am open-hearted, that this is part of the myth and the ritual that was an essential part of what this story is pointing to. And so we see the animal skins of Dionysus and the open nakedness and open-heartedness of Ariadne, and the crown of stars above her head. Here's a detail of this one as he comes from the sea. Carl Jung would say the sea is always a symbol of the depths of the unconscious. So here he emerges here to wed her from that place. And they give her this gift of the corona borealis. So in the wedding procession on the right, they're throwing the wedding crown up to the stars where it stays. So for the Greeks, when they went out at night and they saw this constellation, it had meaning. It had a story associated with it. It had this long story that was connected to rituals that they participated in the world. Now, from that depth psychological perspective, then, I just invite you to consider some of these questions. What does it mean, Ariadne, after she marries Dionysus? She's not often carried about in a chariot with wheels as much as she rides on top of one of these ferocious animals. What might that mean to be able to master, to have on the leash, if you will, the strongest of animal instincts? And they became a very, very happily married couple. Even in this chariot, notice how it's being pulled by wild animals here. And we see in so much of the Greek pottery this sweet nuptial union of the two of them together. Here they are, you can just imagine that what comes next is a kiss. And here they are in procession. What you see with that staff, by the way, was the thrysis. And it was this long staff that had a pine cone at the top, and they would plant it in the procession, and wine would gush from it in the center of town. This was the miracle of the wedding of Ariadne and Dionysus, was these festival processions that ended up with wine spurting unexpectedly and miraculously in order to nourish all in a celebration. So this story of Ariadne and Dionysus wove its way into many of the female initiations in the ancient world. And in some of these rituals that were partaken of by both men and women, there was a 3-day festival. And the first day was a ritual dance, and it was danced on a labyrinth floor. It was a slow processional dance. And most often the accounting that I've heard is that it was 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and that you would hold these hands of going 2 steps forward and 1 step back as a symbol in many ways that that's the spiritual life. How many of you have had that experience? Oh, I'm going forward and I never look back. Good luck. Right? 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And you would be linked holding hands or sometimes scarves as you did this very, very slow ritual dance. Very, very slow with a sense of mystery. Or those are but 3 of Eric Satie's evocations of slow ritual dances in commemoration for the dances on the labyrinth at Gnosis. This is the labyrinth as it was put into Chartres Cathedral. This is a picture that's taken up from the bird's eye of the cathedral looking down. It was placed at the beginning of the 13th century. And it, like this Greek myth, was a profound metaphor of the spiritual life. It was inspired by stories of Ariadne and the Minotaur. And at one point, what you see in the centerpiece right here, it had a brass plaque that was ripped up to make cannonballs during the French Revolution, but there are several reports that say that what was there was the head of a bull. It was the head of the bull. And this was actually a ritual dance was performed here every year on Easter. And it was a slow processional dance in which the bishop of the cathedral would lead with his bishop's staff this slow procession while people followed. And this one, I'm told, had 3 steps forward and 1 step back. 3 in honor of the Trinity. 3 steps forward and 1 step back. And they would arrive in the center, and when they got to the center, the bishop would have a golden ball that was to signify the clue of Ariadne's thread. And there was the ball, tossing of the ball. And it was a profound medieval celebration of Easter that was overlaid on top of this ritual of transformation. So we had the dance here, the dance of the rituals. Here's the labyrinth at Chartres, surrounded by candlelight. And there is the copy of the Chartres pattern at Grace Cathedral. And then there was another ritual, and this was the ritual of lamentation, of weeping. And this imagines Ariadne and what we would feel like if we were betrayed and abandoned on the shores of Naxos. They actually had space in their life to have a ritual of crying. And this is one of the things that's so amazing and mind-boggling, is that we live in a world now where most of the time people apologize for their tears. I'm sorry, they say. Well, in the ancient Greek world, folks, if you were somebody who was prone to crying a lot, you could get a really good job, because the weeping women were thought to be necessary in order that this idea that if we have bottled up tears inside of ourselves, we are in distress. Both our body and soul are at risk. If we are swallowing all of our tears, they'll get stuck and bad things will happen. And so they thought it necessary to actually have time set aside where you would purge your tears. And how can you do that? Well, sometimes you need a little help. And like laughter, which is also associated with Dionysus, tears can be contagious. And so they had women who were really good at crying, and they were to lead the rituals. They were to start the wailing. They were to cry from the depths of their being, and in being able to see somebody else cry, it would loosen us up a little bit so we wouldn't be frozen. So just imagine that. Imagine you're looking in the want ads and it says, weeping women needed. What would the world be like if we actually had this job nowadays? I think we need to reinstitute the job of the weeping women. So there would be this ritual of grief and lamentation, and music then would be played that was in these keys that would elicit that sense of loss. The third day, there were vats of water, and those water jugs were turned into wine. And the wine was broken out and given to everybody around in a celebration of the wedding of Dionysus and Ariadne. All of this would happen on the first full moon in January. And it's pretty fascinating to note then that the very first miracle that we talk about in the life of Jesus is the turning of water into wine at the marriage feast, and that this happens on January 6th. And January 6th begins the season of what is known in the Christian calendar as the season of Epiphany. Epiphanos, the title of Dionysus. Now, the other ways that the ritual life existed then is that there were places set aside for people to come to go through a deep process of transformation. One of the places that survives in the world with artistic and archaeological evidence of these Dionysian rituals is on Pompeii. And because of the volcanic activity, it was buried in ash, and so many of these frescoes are preserved. This was a home that belonged to nobility, where people would come and be set aside for a period of time, in order to engage in this transformation. And on these walls are these amazing frescoes that are saturated with the color red, a color that is associated with the god Dionysus. And here we see the sequence of artistic progression and transformation throughout. The first image is this woman who is garbed with veils upon veils and layers of clothing on the far left. And do you see what she's doing? She's taking her jacket and she's opening it up to begin to open up her heart. Remember that image of Ariadne bare-breasted? So to open up the heart. And then we have the image of the offerings, the woman with the laurel leaf in the purple, and she's carrying this platter. For the festivals of Ariadne, it was honey cakes and sometimes milk and honey that were part of the ceremonies of the ritual life here. And then here in the scene 2, we have a sense of lifting the veil of the mysteries. You see the back of a woman who's holding up a purple cloth as if to say, peekaboo, we're going to unveil the mystery and enter into this drama. And on the far right, we see none other than that figure who was the foster father for Dionysus, Silenus, the one that we saw earlier drunk in his cups, as they might say. And he's playing the lyre as another symbol of the musical transformation that link to the Orphic mysteries. Remember that the lyre is Orpheus's instrument. And then we have some very odd things here. We have a youth who's playing the panpipes, an instrument associated with Dionysus. We see the goat. The goat was another Dionysian symbol. And here we actually have a woman who is nursing the goat. And if we take that at a literal level, it just sounds icky. But if we think about what that means, if we think about what that means symbolically, that inside each of us there are layers. And there's an instinctual part of ourself. There's a rational part of ourself. There's an emotional part of ourself. And there's a spiritual part of ourself. And this fresco evokes, in many Jungians' perspective, this idea that in order to transform, we actually have to have a deeper relationship to what we would call our animal self, our animal nature. That if we cut off all the knowledge of our bodies, which we have done in the West for centuries upon centuries upon centuries, that we're losing an important part of who we are. We have dismembered ourselves. I'll just invite you to think of all the ways in human history that we have actually dismembered our bodies. We don't have to go to the East and think of foot binding. All we have to remember are the corsets of the 19th century. You know, women having ribs taken out so that they could have tinier waists. We even think about the neckties that men wear to work. And I actually have a priest friend who says, why do we wear collars? So that we can cut off our hearts and bodies and only talk from our head. So this idea that in order to really liberate ourselves, we have to return. We have to, in the words of the modern poet Mary Oliver, let the soft animal of our body love what it loves, to be nourished. How can we nourish our animal instinctual self in a way that can also honor the totality of what it is to be human? And so this little goat being fed is a symbol that we have to do that also. And then we have this figure that's so interesting. Here we have a man who's holding a mirror. He's got the beard, and he's looking to the left. And there's a youth who's crouching over his shoulder looking into this mirror. And what he's seeing inside the mirror reflected to him is that scary mask that you see above him that's frightening. Well, this is also part of the initiation, that initiatory practices are about, in their essence, about encountering both the depth and the darkness within. And so to reflect on our dark sides, what Jung would call our shadows, is a necessary part of the transformative process. And then, here in the center of the hallway, we have Dionysus, and unfortunately this was damaged in the earthquakes, but it's Dionysus lying in the lap of Ariadne. You see that thyrsus staff across his lap, and you can see her hand holding the clue. You can barely see it because of the damage here. So there's Dionysus and Ariadne here together in a nuptial embrace. Then we have this scene in which the woman is now not so garbed. She's taken off some of the layers. She's unveiling the truth, and she's reaching for this purple cloth to see the mystery. And then there's this winged figure, these giant wings, and she's holding a whip. And she's actually whipping this woman now who is bare-breasted. Do you see this transformation, kneeling in her purple cloak with her head in the lap of another woman? So this forms a sequence with the angel with the whip is torturing, in some ways, this other woman. And then the same woman, now even more naked, is turning. It's interesting to note that the Greek word for transformation is metanoia, and it means to turn around. So we have here in visual symbolization that somehow suffering may be related to transformation, to turning around and seeing the world in a different way. And after that entire process, now that woman, having gone through the disrobing, the unveiling, the opening the heart, the being naked, the being whipped, being tortured, turning, transforming, now she's ready to step into her initiatory role. So here, she's dressed as a bride getting ready for her wedding. This is, her hair is being pinned up in a particular way. And what you see on the left is the god Eros, the god of love, the god of union. And then the very last image is that now this woman has undergone this journey, and she is now enthroned as a queen, sitting on her own throne of wisdom. Now, we know very little about what was actually done during these mysteries in this villa of Pompeii. Lots of conjecture. But we think that this story and the frescoes are mirrors of a ritual process. And if we think then about the whole myth of Ariadne and Dionysus and what it entails, that it begins in part about this battle with the Minotaur and then encountering loss and abandonment, entering into grief and lamentation. And only after that process are you able to claim your fullness, where the human Ariadne now becomes the bride of the divine. And she is brought from the depths of the underworld into the wedding banquet like Psyche on her journey that we talked about last week. Descent, ascent, union. The descent, the ascent, and the union. And that presiding over all of that is Eros, the god of love, and the creator of the world in that Orphic cosmology that bursts forth from that egg that was bound by that snake here. This is a poem from Louise Gluck about Persephone, but I think it speaks to any ritual of initiation here. My soul shattered with the strain of trying to belong to earth. What will you do when it is your turn in the field with the god? All of these mysteries were designed to take us through the underworld to become bigger, to leave behind the small confines of our life and to enter into something that was so much deeper, so much grander, and not just because it would make us feel better, but it would make us fit to actually help and heal the world. The purpose of grief rituals and why they could never be done alone was that grief was not something that you can stand alone. It was believed that it was so important that you do this. In the Dionysian tragedies, we have some surviving of Euripides, of Oedipus Rex. They were so important that prisoners had to be let free to come, to cry during these rituals of drama, to sing and to cry together. Because if anybody was left out of the mourning process, the world around them would suffer. How many people there are who are suffering alone in our world. We have a great need to reclaim some of this wisdom of the ancient Greek world, to find ways to grieve together. And one of the people that I know who is doing so much around this, I'll just recommend to all of you, is this wonderful psychotherapist, Frances Weller, who has written two of the most gorgeous books I know of about grief, The Wild Edge of Sorrow and Entering the Healing Ground. And he is creating rituals around grief and has been doing so for 25 years. And we've been in conversation about reimagining what it might be like to bring rituals of grief and actually unite them with the labyrinth, like they did in the ancient world. So in the coming year, there will be a series of one-day workshops of myth rituals going more deeply into these myths of transformation throughout the year that will end with work that sometimes will include grief rituals and will always include labyrinth rituals. The place that is closest in the world that I know of that keeps alive a sense of transformation through ritual is at Chartres Cathedral. And as for 800 years, the labyrinth has become a place of profound transformation. And September of 2018, there will be a week-long exploring about these great mysteries with a ritual that descends into the underworld and is lit by 3,000 candles before you ascend again and walk the labyrinth to confront your own darkness and your own fears and find yourself liberated into the light. The next part of the Roots of Wisdom will focus on Jung and archetypal psychology. It will look at these patterns that we see cross-culturally that invite us to claim the fullness. What we have started to explore here in these 6 weeks is above all this theme of being born from the heart by remembering that which has been cut apart. To see that there is a deeper connection, a thread that we can follow, that will find our way through, that will connect us to the past, but also to the deepest parts of ourselves. And to do that, we need to sink into the depths of our heart, to open them up, to connect to the stories, the myths of the past, to realize that we're not so separate as we thought, that actually the velvet gentleman who lived down the street from Sacré-Cœur, Eric Satie, is connected to the myths of Ariadne and Dionysus, and the man who lies buried on the top of the hill of Sacré-Cœur, that Isis and the Virgin Mary are right next to each other. That there are ways that all of these invite us to remember that there is but one story about what it is to be human. And perhaps we can celebrate it all. The darkness, the light, and everything in between. Thank you.